Now that we've got authentication, we can focus on all of the routes that only logged in users can see. The first page that we'll work on is the Edit Profile page. But before we start work on that, we want to find a means to pass all of the current user's information to any component or page in our app. So a convenient means of doing that, like we saw within the auth.js file, is context. So we created some context for authorization related information. Now we're going to create some context for the user information. And the way that we're going to get the currently logged in user's information is with the help of what we're passing down on auth. Specifically, we're going to grab the user's ID and we're going to use it to perform a request in order to get the user's current information at that time, all of the information that we want from Hasura. So we're going to begin in app.js. This is where we're going to be creating the context, and this is going to be called user context. So we can make this above our app component. We can export const user context equal to react.createContext. And as I mentioned, we want to get some data from authState, namely authState.user, or is it authState.user, or it might be, yes, that's correct. So from authState.user, we're getting all of the information from Firebase as to our current user, and we know that we can get their ID, the Firebase ID, from the UID property. So we'll store the result of that in a variable called user ID. Now we're only going to get this value if we're authenticated. So we'll set up a ternary here and say if we're auth, then we're going to be able to access the UID. Otherwise we want to put on user ID null. And we're going to take this and use this value as a variable. So we'll pass this to a variables object as the property and value. And we're going to pass this to a new request, and for this we're going to be using a subscription. So we'll import use subscription from Apollo React hooks, and we're going to write this in just a second, but let's just import that for now. And at this point we don't have too much information that we need to get, only the direct properties of the user that we put in the table. You might have been asking in the users table, that is, you might have been asking how are we going to get information like the user's posts or the user's comments. Well, we'll take a look at that in a second, but for now we just want to get all of the columns that we've previously set up. So let's head to subscriptions, and we can go ahead and import GQL from Apollo Boost. And we're going to create a subscription with a name that's pretty straightforward, pretty conventional, and this is going to be called the me subscription. It's often a query or a subscription where we get all of the current user's data. So let's go to our console and write this out, and this is going to be a subscription with the name me. And let's think about how we're going to get this. It's going to be for users. Let's add a new, I want to add a new subscription, and it's for users where, and we're going to search according to the user ID. Remember, we're storing the Firebase ID, UID, on the user ID field here, and we want to make sure it's equal to whatever we provide. So this will be me, and we're going to call this the user ID, and it's going to be optional. So we can pass a null value here if we don't have a user. So where the user ID, user underscore ID is equal to user ID, and for right now we'll get back the following fields. Let's grab ID, user ID, name, username, profile image, and last checked. So we can test this out. We do have to perform a query where we're getting one of the user IDs. And then we can pass that in as the query variable value, any one of them. And good, that's performed successfully. So we can copy all of this and paste it in for the me variable, then go back to app, and then execute it with use subscription, pass in me, import it, and what are we going to get back? We're going to get back data and loading, very similar to a query. And if we're loading, we want to show the loading screen. So right above our conditional here, we'll add another one, if loading, then we want to return the loading screen, which we'll import. And let's move down this variable, isModal_open. We'll move it to underneath our conditional here for our unauth routes. And we want to create a variable for me, that is the current user. This is the value that we're going to be using across our app to get all of the data that we requested here, and we're going to add to this subscription later on. We're going to add more fields. But to get that value, we're going to need to add a conditional if we're authenticated and we have our data, then we can get from this data.users and then the first element, so the 0th element of this array, so data.users 0th, otherwise null for me. And underneath that, once we have me, we can create some variables. Instead of having to say, me.id to get the current user's ID, we could just create a variable current user ID is set to me.id. Again, we'll add other values here. And for these fragments, we can now add user context.provider and put on the value prop an object with both me and current user ID for now. So let's save everything. And as I mentioned, we'll be working in the edit profile page first. Oh, and I made a mistake. Hopefully you caught this. We need to provide variables, of course, for our subscription to work here. Now I can head to our edit profile page. And naturally, to get a given user's information according to their ID, we need to actually have the user's ID, which we're passing now through that user context. So just to test this out, we can say react.useContext, and we'll import the exported user context, and we can console log both me and current user ID. And good, we get both values like we would expect. Now the next step will be to take the current user ID and make a request for all of the appropriate fields just for the edit profile page. So we want some additional information that we don't exactly need in our subscription. So we'll take the ID and make a different request. So what are we going to need for the edit profile page? Well, let's write this as a query. So we're going to add a new query with users. And you've noticed that for queries that we've had to make or subscriptions that we've had to make where we're using the where operator, it returns an array of users, and we usually have to select the 0th element even if we know that we're just going to have one user returned to us. So there's a more convenient way to get just one user instead of having to get a whole set of them and to grab the first one. And the way to do that is with the users by PK query. users by primary key, and it always accepts it according to whatever we've set as the primary key. For our users table, remember that we set the ID as the primary key. So we will need to pass that as the variable, provide that as the variable and pass to the ID argument to get that data. Now we're going to call this query get edit user profile, and we're going to return the ID, the username and name, the email, bio, profile image, website, and phone number, all of that. So we can grab one of the IDs and add an ID variable up at the top, and this will be of type UUID and required, and then we'll provide the query variable in the area underneath and make sure that this works, and it does. Good. So we can copy all of this, and in the queries file we'll now export const get edit user profile and paste that in, and then we can remove the me value that we're destructuring. We just need current user ID, and we'll create a variables object, and we can set current user ID to the ID property. We'll want to use a query here and import get edit user profile. We're going to get back data and loading. So here too we want to add an if condition. If loading, we want to return the loading screen. And once again, I forgot to pass in variables. And remember that we're passing in all of the data down here to edit user info on the user prop. Well, if we look at our console, we see that we're getting our user data on data.users by PK. So we can remove the default current user reference, data.users underscore by underscore PK, and we can actually get rid of that import. Now, we're going to be doing this throughout as we replace all of our dummy data with the real data that we're fetching. So we're passing down user to edit user info. Let's go there. For right now, I believe we can just save both of our files and see what we have. Good. Now the issue is that we're still not providing the user image here, but we are passing down all the appropriate information here, the username, name, and the email. We haven't filled out the sections for website or bio or phone number just yet. We'll see how to in just a sec. But we want to provide our image to the profile picture component, and remember it had an image prop which we're setting to this default value. I'm not going to remove that just yet, but we can actually pass in a value to it at this moment. We can set image to user.profile image, and we can remove the user prop that it had, and we'll save, and we should be able to see our actual avatar now. And we do. Perfect. And in a little while, we'll add the ability to change our profile photo. See how to do that. But for right now, let's take care of validating all of this too. Remember that we need to apply the same rules here, just as well as we did in the sign up and login pages. We need to validate this form. We need to make sure, for example, that the username isn't one that's taken by another user already. We need to make sure that the website is an actual URL. We need to make sure the bio is not too long. We need to make sure that the email isn't another user's email. And we need to check to see that the phone number is an actual real phone number. So some validation here is going to be repeated, but we know how to take care of this. We need to bring in the use form hook from React hook form, and we'll call that up at the top of edit user info. Again, we can be explicit and set mode to on blur, and we're going to get register and handle submit. We'll start with the name input. Now, how we handled this was a little bit different because we used this component that we created, section item. And if we go to section item, we'll see that it is a text field. So we're going to need to add a prop for the input ref, as well as the name for each of these fields, these text fields. So name is going to be set to name, and input ref is going to be set to input ref. So let's start with the one for name, section item with the text set to name. Here we'll set name to name, and the input ref is again going to receive register, and this is going to be required. The min length is going to be 5, the max is going to be 20. We can just copy this and go to username. Name is username, and here we want to add our regex pattern to only accept A through Z, upper and lowercase, 0 through 9, underscores and periods, all the way to the end. And then for the website, this will be a little bit different. It'll have the name of website, but we want to make sure, we want to validate it and make sure it's an actual URL. So if we look at validator, if we scroll down, we'll see that there is an isURL function. So we pass in a string. It's going to give us a Boolean value as to whether it's valid or not, a valid URL. But we need to provide some options here, and that's because we can't just have it be an address without a protocol at the beginning, meaning we can't just have it be, say, if someone's website was npmjs.com, we would need to have HTTPS at the beginning so that it would actually, so that the link would work. Otherwise, it's going to attempt to go to, in our case, localhost 3000 / npmjs.com. That wouldn't be good. So we need to have that protocol at the beginning. So we'll specify that option, what our accepted protocols are, and we want to use this require protocol option to set that to true. So here for register, this isn't required, unlike name and username, but we will use validate, and we're going to pass in the input, and we're going to use isURL. We're going to need to import that up at the top, and that's going to be from import isURL from validator lib isURL. And this is going to be set up a little bit differently, because if we pass just input to isURL, it's going to return false when there's just an empty string. So we're going to need to make sure that we actually have a value there. The input is greater than 0. So we'll just use this expression. We'll coerce Boolean input to a Boolean, and if it's true, if someone's typed something there, we'll use the isURL function. Otherwise, we'll just return true and say that it's valid. Now again, we have to pass our options as the second argument. So we'll provide that protocols array, and we'll include HTTP and HTTPS, and we'll set require underscore protocol to true. And then for our bio, the name is bio, and for it's not going to be required, we're only going to set a max length, they can set anything up to 120 characters. And one other thing that I want to mention, instead of making this a controlled form, remember that with React Hook form, we're not using a controlled form. Since we're not using one, we need to find a way to pass the initial value without it being controlled by the value prop. The way that we can do that, and if we don't tell React that this is uncontrolled, if we still act like this is a controlled input, a controlled form, it's going to give us a warning. You can't change a controlled to an uncontrolled form or uncontrolled component. We need to, instead of using the value prop, use the default value prop, both for this text field and then for the one at the very bottom within section item. We just need to make that small change and we won't get that error anymore. It's going to set the initial value that we're getting from our query, from our get edit user profile query, but after that we can update it as needed with the help of what we're passing to input ref, the register function. Next we'll go to the section item with the text email. So for the email input, it'll have the name email, and since the user needs to have it, the required will be true, and validate, we'll still use validate. Here we're going to pass the input to is email directly. And finally we have the one for phone number. Again, we need to check and make sure that this is an actual phone number. So the name will be phone number in camel case, and for the input ref we'll have register, but required will be set to false, so we don't need to include it really. But for validate, we'll do the same trick as we did with the website. We'll get the input, convert it to a Boolean if someone's typed in, then we want to perform that check. And there is another, I made a mistake up above, I forgot to import is email. Hopefully you caught that. So we'll import is email from the validator library, and we also want to grab is phone number, or is mobile phone. And there's some additional options that you can take a look at for that if you want to add additional constraints. Okay, so heading back down, we'll call is mobile phone against what was typed in, otherwise return true. And I believe that's all the validation that we need. So we'll go up and find our form, and for the onSubmit, we'll wrap handle submit around our own onSubmit function, and we'll add that, get our data in the parameters, and console log it. So let's test this out. Now note we're not going to have an icon at the very end. We're just going to have, as we've seen before, the input focused whenever there's an error with something that we're trying to submit. So if there's a validation error, say with the name, it's going to be focused like so when we attempt to submit it. So for name, if we try to remove it and hit submit, it's not going to work. It's still just going to stay focused, so we need to set that to something valid. For the username, if there's a white space there and hit submit, that's not going to work. If this is not an actual website, let's say we just include website.com where it doesn't include the protocol, that's going to be selected, but if we use HTTPS, that'll work. That should work fine. And then for email, we have validation working there. And for phone number, if we just type something really long and submit it, it's not going to work. But if it's 10 digits, that works. Oh, and for bio, if it's too long. Yeah, that too fails. So once everything's valid, we can hit submit and make sure that all of our properties are updated correctly, and it looks like they are. We have all 6 here. Now the next step will be to perform a mutation and to actually update all of this information in our database. So let's write this out in our console. We know that we're going to define the given user and then update their name, username, website, bio, email, and phone number, all 6 of those fields. So let's write that. So we want a new mutation, and this is going to be called edit user. We can remove the type name field. We want to update a user. Note that we can update a user with the update users option or update users by PK, whichever one you want. I'm going to use just update users where the ID is equal to what we'll call a variable that we'll call ID, and we want to set the name, username, website, bio, email, and phone number, all 6 of those. So, and then finally we can just set affected rows. So we're going to need to have variables for ID. They'll be of type UUID and required. And we want non-null values for each of these variables. Name, string and required, and I believe these are all strings, so username, string and required, website, string and required, bio, string and required, email, and phone number, but make sure once again to use phone number in camel case. And we'll pass those to their appropriate arguments. Okay, that looks good. We don't necessarily need to test this out in the console. So I'll just add this to mutations, export default, export const, edit user, paste that in. Then we will use mutation here in edit user info, we'll import it, and edit user. We'll get back our mutate function, which we'll call edit user. And here in our onSubmit, we want to set up a try catch for our error handling. So we're going to try to edit our user. So we'll make this an exiting function and we'll await edit user. And we want to collect all of our variables, so we'll make a variables object. Note that from looking at data, if we have data here, we don't have the ID value, so we'll need to get that from the props, namely user ID. So we'll spread in data, and the ID value will be set to user.id. Then we'll await edit user. But there's one small thing that we need to do before we actually execute this mutation. Note that the email that we have here that we've saved in our Hasura database in our users table, this is going to be out of sync with what we have stored in Firebase. If we go to the authentication tab for that given user, it's going to be out of sync. And if they're logging in specifically with their email, they're logging in with that, they might think that they've actually changed the email on the Firebase side and they can log in with that new email when they haven't. So we need to update the email both in our Postgres database as well as wherever Firebase is storing it in our authentication section. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to need to head back to auth and create another function for that to take care of updating the email. So let's just call this, we'll add it at the bottom, and this will be an async function, and we'll call this update email. And this is going to accept the new email. And this is going to be pretty straightforward to actually be able to update it on the Firebase side. We just have to await auth state.user.update email. And if you want, you can console log auth state.user afterwards to make sure that it is in fact updated. Now we can pass update email to our object that we're putting on the value prop of our auth context, and we need to read from auth context here in edit user info. We'll import that and grab just the update email function. Now this we want to call before calling edit user. We don't want it to update the email on the Hasura side of things and then fail on the Firebase side of things. We need to make sure it works on Firebase first. So we'll call update email and pass through the email from data, that data object. Now we're familiar with error handling. So first of all, in the catch, we're going to console error with the message error updating profile and pass through the error object. And we can just grab from the sign-up page that entire handle error function. Now note that we're going to need, back in edit profile, some dedicated state for the error. But instead of using a string for the error message, we're actually going to use an object. So it's going to include a type for the error as well as the related message. And that's because we want to be a little bit more specific, because we want to show it in a certain place. We want to show an email error right here, and we want to show a username error right here. So we need to be very specific about what type of error it is, so we can perform a check for it for the appropriate input. So again, we're going to call this error in the setter set error, and we're going to handle the error in the catch and pass through the error to it, and paste handle error here. But as I mentioned, for what we're setting on the error, we're going to include some extra info. So the message will be, if there's an error for username, the message is going to be username already taken, and the type is going to be username. And we could say here, this username is already taken. Then otherwise, if the error code includes the auth, again, the message will be error.message, but the type is going to be email. So now to show it in the appropriate place, we need to take the updated error object and pass it through to the section item. So it needs to have an error prop, so we'll destructure that too from section item, and we're going to provide that data both on username, error set to error, and also for email. We don't have to provide it to all of them. Now, where are we going to show it? Well, fortunately, each text field has a little area underneath, and that is displayed with the help of the prop helper text. So we can add a conditional here. If we have an error, so we'll add a question mark. If we have an error and the type is equal to the name, so if the type is username and it's equal to the text field for which the name is the same, username, then we want to show the error message. And finally, what we need to do is clear out the error at the beginning of executing on submit. So we need to set the error with just its initial values, type as an empty string and message as an empty string. Now, instead of having to copy this, we can put this in a variable called, say, default error and place this above our component. So with all that done, let's make sure to save both of our files that we changed, and let's try updating our user. Let's try updating the name first and hit submit. And if we refresh, we see that the change is persisted. Now if we try the username, if we try to change that to something that another user has and hit submit, we see our error text, this username is already taken, perfect. And if we refresh, it reverts to the previous value, good. And then if we do the same with the email, we use an email that's already been taken. We see here, whenever we try to update the email, this operation is sensitive and requires recent authentication. Log in again before trying this request. So let's do that. If it prompts our user to do that, we can log out and then log back in. I believe we logged in with Facebook. So let's log in again and go to edit profile and try changing our name to changing our email to one that's taken by another user and hit submit. It tells us the email address is already in use by another account. Now if we try to change this to just anything else and hit submit, it looks like it's updated. The error message goes away, and if we look at our user, the user data, we see that the email here is updated to what we typed in. And if we refresh, we see that it's persisted in our Postgres database as well. Now we can remove the console log since we see that it's working from update email. And one last thing we can do, I'm just going to change my email back really quickly. One last thing that we can do here, before we tackle things like changing the profile photo, we'll take a look at that in the next step. What we can do at the moment is we can add, when we've submitted our data successfully and performed our mutation successfully, when we hit submit, we can show a little snack bar at the bottom, and I believe that's the Instagram behavior as well. It shows a little snack bar that says that the profile's been updated. So let's do that using the snack bar component from Material UI back in Edit Profile. And let's add that directly underneath our form here. We'll add our snack bar and import it. And we'll add the message first. It's going to be within a span, and it's just going to say profile updated. We can set it open by passing a value to this open prop by setting its value to true or false. Once it's opened, we're going to have this controlled by state, obviously, so we'll have an open piece of state. After it's been opened, after this value is set to true, We can set an auto hide duration, period of time after which it's just going to go away after that value is set to true. I'll set it to 6,000 or 6 seconds. And we can also provide a transition component for how it slides into view. I'm going to use the slide component, so I'm going to need to make sure that I import that. And finally, we're going to need a means for it to close itself. So we're going to need to provide the logic to the snack bar to say, hey, when you want to close it, either automatically or manually, we need to tell you how to do that. So for onClose, if we wanted to provide a little checkbox at the end, or a little a cross or an X to close out, we could do that. We could add a button, but I don't feel the need to do that. I'm just gonna add some related open state that by default will be false. So we'll have open and set open, and so we can just pass an inline function to onClose. And obviously, if we want to close it, if open is true, we want to set open to false. So let's give that a shot. One last thing to make it work when we successfully update our data is we need to, within onSubmit at the very end, set open to true. So if we have an invalid value, an invalid form, and we hit submit, we don't see anything. We just see that input highlighted. But when it becomes valid, we hit submit, and we see our little snack bar at the bottom profile updated, and then it should vanish after 6 seconds.